Legend has it that the household prison of Cuntville is known for being the most dangerous place to ever exist. The inmates on death row are subjected to the most brutal form of torture mankind has ever seen.
Hey, what the hell is this supposed to mean?
Gun.
Yeah, no shit.
Aquabia. 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 Aquabia.
Aquabiol, cunts. For those of you who are not familiar with this creature who I just showed, meet Gazi the African Hitler Kodzo, a self-proclaimed revolutionary and a black supremacist YouTuber with more than 47,000 subscribers who tries to empower the black folks. And how does he do it, you ask?
All white people are racist. Each and every one of them.
White people, come here. Stop adopting black children.
He does it by being a fucking racist. He's the type of racist who's filled with so much hatred against a particular race that he'd go as far as to promote violence against them.
But I really want to talk about the title, which is Why Cop Killers Are Black Heroes.
Remember the BLM kidnapping when a bunch of creatures from the Dark Lagoon kidnapped a mentally disabled person and tortured him for more than a day while simultaneously yelling, "Allahu Akbar!" Wait, that's not right.
Fuck Donald Trump, nigga. Fuck white people.
There you go. It didn't really matter if you're black, white, brown or orange. You just look at that shit and go, that's just fucked. But Gazi, on the other hand, he shows the highest level of sanctimonious graciousness.
Some of my people kidnapped one of your people, put him in a tub and beat him up a little bit. You know, they scraped him up a little bit, tied him, went on live stream and stuff about it. Have you heard about it?
Yes.
Crazy, right? But actually it's not so crazy since, you know, your people built an entire capitalist, imperialist society on top of my people.
Martin Luther King would be so proud of you right now, Gazi. But here's the thing. This is the side of Gazi Kodzo most of you all already knew. An anti-white racist troglodyte which originated itself onto YouTube on July 16, 2014 and has been spreading itself like a plague, influencing people through racist ideologies while occasionally cackling like a chicken.
What up, them? What up, them?
And he has been continuously gaining new supporters to this very day. But what most of you all do not know about Gazi is that there's a whole another different dimension to the twisted mind of his. Before Gazi transformed into a full-blown racist edition of Ruby Rod from The Fifth Element, dedicating his channel to making more than 150 anti-white videos, he was just a normal guy making some freestyle vlogs and mobile phone reviews for AndroidHeadlines.com under the name Smile Tone.
Hey y'all, it's me, Smile Tone, and today we're gonna talk about. What are we gonna talk about? Today we're gonna talk about the Kin. Have y'all heard about the Kin, y'all? It's this new phone that Microsoft just put out, and reports are showing that it only sold 500 units.
And completely opposite to his current fuck those toilet seat complexion, Neanderthal DNA driven walking talking tubs of mayonnaise filled bird turds, aka white people. See Gazi, I'm good at insulting people too. But before building this anti-white persona, Gazi Kodzo was just a normal gay person flaunting his faggotry and fooling around with a bunch of crazy white chicks under the common white girl tag.
Hey guys, what's up? We're the Wing Girls, as you know, and we've got a special guest today. It's Smile Tone! Hey Isn't he cute? Okay guys, comment below who is the most common white girl out of the three of us.
So now the grand question arises. What made this man be consumed with so much hatred against a particular race that he'd end up forming a cult of activists to push his racist agenda? What triggers a human being into becoming a racist? This is what we'll be systematically dissecting throughout this series. So come to the dark side as we use Gazi Kodzo as a test subject to dive into the twisted mind of a racist to understand, nay, to destroy the various moral reasonings he upholds to justify his acts as a depraved racist. On with the show then.
Danny, did you know that black on black crime is actually white people's fault? Yes, because white people created this parasitic capitalist system that we call the American economy that was actually built off of black people. Enslaved African people built the American economy.
Some of my people kidnapped one of your people, put him in a tub and beat him up a little bit. You know, they scraped him up a little bit, tied him, went on live stream and stuff about it. Have you heard about it?
I did. I heard about it.
Crazy, right? But actually it's not so crazy since, you know, your people built an entire capitalist, imperialist society on top of my people. You know, you want to talk about kidnapping and torture. Can we talk about the almost 700 years of kidnapping and torture of African people?
Yes, I mean, every dream and aspiration of every white person comes at the expense of every African person in this country and on this planet. We are a colonizer population. We live on the backs of African people. So when an African person whose backs we sit on rises up and tries to push us off, that is not the same. You cannot judge that with the same moral compass as you would the behavior of the one who's been lynching and murdering and raping African people for hundreds of years.
Alright then, so let's get this right. If race A dehumanized and mistreated race B in ancient history, then it's justified to hold a grudge all the way to the present to dehumanize and mistreat race A because they did it first. Here's something which people need to consider when analyzing history, and that is to stop judging the historical events of the previous centuries through the moral standards of the 21st century. See, history is quite tricky, and it gets even worse when you bring moral standards into the equation. Historical events and historical figures are the product of what was right or wrong in that particular society at that particular time. So if you're going to be judging the events of the past, then you need to be looking at it from the moral standards of the past. A common misconception which not just Gazi and his minions but a fuckload of people make is that they try to relate racism as the source for countless amount of people tortured through slavery, and then they try to judge the people who practiced this in the past as evil. And on top of this, they take everything one step further and blame the current generation for the mistakes of their ancestors. This is just oversimplification of history at its finest. It ends up completely misrepresenting history to push people's own narratives. The initial pattern for slavery was neither about racism nor was it evil. It was about power. The skin color of the slaves and their origins were irrelevant. All you needed to end up as a slave was to be on the losing side of a war. But if you need to truly understand this concept and get some sort of a clue on how to minimize, to end racism, then you need to know what slavery is and why it began in the first place. So here's several centuries worth of condensed history lesson in 12 minutes. Back in the past, people had their lives much harder than us. They had a very limited exposure to different cultures and different races, so they did not distinguish themselves on racial grounds. Instead, they ended up forming different communities or different tribes and distinguished themselves based on that. These communities consisted of hunters, gatherers, and primitive farmers. They did not own slaves because having a slave means having an extra stomach to feed. It was an economic disadvantage. But the living conditions in the past grew much more brutal. They had to face starvation without the modern methods of agriculture, extreme weather condition without having different types of shelter and clothing like we do. Plagues and different diseases made death very common. Furthermore, people did not have modern machineries like we do. They had to do manual labor to support their communities. So to combat this miserable shithole of a life they were living in, they decided to conquer the lands from neighboring communities for food, clothing, and shelter to prevent their communities from falling. Now let's play ancient warfare decisions. To conquer an enemy land, what do? Option A, kill every one of them. If you choose this, then you're the dumbest motherfucker on this planet. Option B, kill some, let the remaining free. Better choice, but there is a chance that the enemy might regroup, form better strategies, and strike back. Fun fact, that's what Genghis Khan did, and ain't nobody got time for that shit. Therefore, it could be a potential harm to your own community. So basically, you're trying to kill yourself. Option C, kill some, enslave the rest. Ding ding ding, right answer. This way, there is no chance of the enemy regrouping. There is no need to kill everyone, and furthermore, we can use these slaves to do the manual labor. Do I sound like a psychopath? You're damn right. But a more important question is...
But fucking A, Abster, there's a fourth option. Why did people have to kill others? Were the people at ancient times psychopaths who had no value for others' lives? Why?
Fuck off, you stupid toy which I'll never use again. Back in the past, life expectancy was very low. Child mortality was enormous. Plagues, diseases, and starvation made death a very common phenomenon. People died terribly and constantly day in and day out. They didn't know when the next snow is going to freeze them, and they didn't know when the next deadly disease is going to wipe them in a swoop. People lived a very short and brutal life, which ended up in them getting more and more desensitized to death. And as a consequence of all these factors, people started to consider human lives as less special. So no, they weren't psychopaths, they were just victims of the environmental factors which were present during that time, and they did what any other human being would have done. They survived. Back to slavery. Given the option to kill everyone or kill yourself, slavery was the most logical and less brutal decision which people could have taken to move forward and flourish as a community. Slavery became the most dominant method of securing cheap labor. If the slaves had a problem with it, then the other alternative was to outright murder them. This was a time when wars were common. Might made what's right. And if you want to control the losing side to your benefit, then you do it through fear. You do it by exercising your power over them. The very origin of slavery was a result of various logical decisions which was done for survival and economic advantage, and it was facilitated through the use of power. At no point in this timeline did race even play a significant role in determining who gets to be the slave. It didn't matter if you were black, white, brown or an attack helicopter. All you needed to end up as a slave was to be on the losing side of a war. So now the question is, when did race-based slavery develop? Race-based slavery took a while to develop and it was an inevitable outcome. Let's take black slavery for an example. In early colonial period, when settlements were relatively small, the first form of labor the farmers in America had were in the form of indentured servants. It consisted of poor Englishmen who worked for the wealthy plantation owners for a fixed number of years as a way to pay off some sort of a debt. But as settlements grew, people started to farm tobacco, cotton and cane. This required an unlimited supply of labor to ensure the timely production in the European markets. So people started looking for labor wherever they could find it. Now the obvious question is, why was Africa chosen as the supply? Simple, because Africa already had a slavery system in place which the Americans could utilize. Furthermore, African political leaders were willing to trade slaves for gun, food and other raw materials. And before people go all
greedy black people sold their fucking innocent black people as slaves.
Africans sold their children into slavery. Africa started the slave trade.
African from Africa sold us to white and French for slavery. They sold our own people, their own people, in slavery.
The statement Africans sold their own race or black people sold their own is technically right, the same way Gazi saying that white people kidnapped black people is also technically right, because that's what ended up happening a lot of times. But the problem with such statements is that it oversimplifies an incredibly complex event, and it's primarily used either to make black people feel ashamed of their history, or it's used by black people themselves to go into a downward spiral of guilt. Africans during that time did not have the sense of racial identity. They did not identify themselves as Africans or black people. They identified themselves as belonging to a particular tribe. And similar to every other fucking place where slavery was already established, they were involved in various wars against different communities and different tribes. The prisoners of these wars, irrespective of what your skin color is, were captured as slaves, and the said slaves were sold during trade. So no, Africans were not selling their own, they were selling prisoners of war. And if you're not able to understand this, then rewatch the previous segment, because that was the entire point of it. The African slaves were brought as indentured servants to work in the plantation along with Irish, English and servants of various other races. And during this time period, we have a very important person of interest. A person whose name appeared in the 1625 Virginia census as Antonio, a Negro, who was listed as a servant. Once Antonio finished his term as a servant, he was a free man. He went on to earn enough money to have his own modest estate. He changed his name to Anthony Johnson. He married and banged a woman named Mary, who was also an indentured servant, and guess what comes next? He owned his own servants similar to a privileged Englishman, and some of his servants were white.
As Anthony Johnson is accumulating property, it seems as though his situation is secure. You get a sense of this individual, this black man, being treated like any white planter, and his wife and daughters being treated like the wife of a planter.
At an early moment when men and women were sorting themselves out, when the rules, the etiquette of race, labor, were not so clear.
And it was not just Anthony Johnson, there were other free black folks who owned servants as well. This is important as it indicates the power structure of the past. It was not divided based on your skin color or your race, because there were black servants along with white servants, and there were black masters along with white masters. But the power was divided based on your economic status, that is the amount of land you own. The more land you own, the more power you have. It was not the white people dominated the black people, it was the rich people who dominated the poor people. But a much more fascinating event related to Anthony Johnson was the Kesor suit. One of Anthony Johnson's servants, John Kesor, completed his 7-year indenture and asked for his freedom. Anthony Johnson, the ex-indentured servant, thought otherwise and denied his request. He eventually let Kesor free when he faced some pressure from his family, but he somehow changed his mind later. Anthony Johnson filed a case stating that Kesor was Anthony's for life and was not an indentured servant. He ultimately won the case, and not only did he get his servant back, but John Kesor became Anthony Johnson's servant for life. This was the first instance of a judicial determination in the 13 colonies holding that a person who has committed no crime could be held in servitude for life. And John Kesor became the first person to be declared a slave in a civil case, and Anthony Johnson his master. So technically that made Anthony Johnson the very first black slave owner. Of course there were other slaves and slave owners, but this was the first time when slavery was legally allowed in the colonies, when the person who was declared as the slave committed no crime. And I don't want this to be used as a haha, look at that, black people, a black person was the very first official slave owner type nonsense, because that serves no purpose. I want this event to be used as a showcase to indicate humans' natural tendency to be seduced by power. Once a person gains power, he not only learns to use it, but he begins to abuse it. It's basic human tendency to be attracted to gaining more power. This was literally the same mindset which the American colonists operated on. They did everything which was remotely possible for them to do in order to gain more wealth and in turn gain more power. And a sequence of events led to black people being reduced to slaves. It began with the transition from indentured servants to slavery. The problem the plantation owners faced was not only a decreasing number of indentured servants, but they faced this increasing problem of what to do with these indentured servants once they live out the term. They had to be given land, freedom dues, and one of those dues included guns. And there was a lot of unrest in Virginia. So they thought of having a more permanent solution, that is having servants without an expiry date in their contracts, that is permanent servants, aka hello slavery. So now there's a reason for the wealthy Englishmen to be attracted towards slavery. And there was only one obstacle in their way: religion. Historically, Englishmen only enslaved non-Christians and captives of war, and they did not seem to associate Christianity to a white-only race, which is why before taking the non-Christian African slaves to Virginia, they baptized them. This also prevented them from enslaving the Africans. But the question which later arises was, what if the non-Christians learned English and converted to the Protestant church? Well, if that was the case, they should be released and be given freedom dues. Obviously, this would be an economic disadvantage. The two people who fell into this category of non-Christians and captives of war were the Native Americans and the Africans, which unfortunately feeds more into people being split racially. They declared that baptism of slaves will not free them from slavery. They also coupled that by declaring that Africans and Native Americans were not allowed to buy Christian slaves. And the final nail in the coffin was when the indentured servants became free, they started posting threats to the plantation owners. In September of 1676, an army of 500 Virginians of all classes and races rose up in arms against the governor William Berkeley and burned down the capital Jamestown, sending the government into hiding. Bacon's rebellion demonstrated that the poor whites and the poor blacks could unite with a cause. This was a great fear to the white ruling class, and it made the transition to racial slavery even more quicker.
This disorder that the indentured servant system had created made racial slavery to Southern slaveholders much more attractive, because what were black slaves now? Well, they were a permanent, dependent labor force who could be defined as a people set apart. They were racially set apart. They were outsiders. They were strangers. And in many ways throughout the world, with a couple possible exceptions, slavery has taken root especially well when the people who are enslaved are defined as strangers, as outsiders, and can therefore be put into an inheritable, permanent status of slavery.
All these factors together made indentured servitude less attractive to the wealthy Englishmen and slavery more attractive, specifically black slavery more attractive. And when the cycle of events which led to black slavery kept happening again and again, people got desensitized and accustomed to slavery and the inhumane consequences it brought along with it. The abnormal became the new normal. Slavery, which started out of economic necessity, turned into just a way of living. It became part of the American culture to own slaves, and as a result, a heavy demand was created for slavery. and different ways of acquiring slaves began. Pirates offered their captives for sale. Criminals were sentenced to slavery, and unpayable debt resulted in slavery. People who were reduced to poverty sold their own children to slavery. The children of slaves were slaves themselves. There was a huge increase in black slaves in a country where the majority of the rich ruling class were in the form of white Englishmen, and the obvious results followed. The identity of Africans was reduced to slaves, and unfortunately the difference in their skin color made it quite easy for the Americans to differentiate their own from the African slaves. This is what led to race-based discrimination, aka enter racism. And enter Abster. Here's how the whole condensed historical segment ties in with our test subject, Gazi Kodzo, his minions, and racism in general. Judging the events of the past with the moral compass of the present is what historians call as moral presentism. And this, according to me, is one of the root cause of racism. The reason why this happens is because many historians have this habit. They avoid passing moral judgments onto history completely. What they do is they describe an historical event and then they describe the impacts the event had caused. And as a result of this, the history taught in the education system, the textbooks and a fuck ton of online sources describe the events of the past like slavery in a very meaningless and unhelpful way. Millions of black people were sold by Africans and were enslaved by Americans. And what was the impact? The rights of black people was being reduced and they had to fight for several centuries to attain their freedom. What ends up happening is that you get people who absorb all these blank statements without being given a backstory as to what were the core reasons which led to slavery, or what could have been the moral justifications people might have had during the time and age to even consider practicing slavery. So when people are faced with insufficient historical data without being given the core reasons and moral justifications as to why things happened, we tend to do what comes to us naturally. We look at this entire course of events and try to analyze the actions of others using the moral standards we currently possess.
Africa sold millions of slaves.
Well, they must be greedy cons.
Americans enslaved millions of Africans.
Well, fuck those evil white people.
N number of people were tortured, killed and beheaded before conquering the land.
Well, people in the past were inhumane savages. But the problem is when you're going to be viewing several centuries worth of ancient history, with the moral compass of the present century, all you're going to see are evil barbarians doing inhumane shit. And what you get as a result of this is the rise of many Gazi Kodzos. People who feel that they have been wronged by history. People who feel that their ancestors were brutally mistreated because of their race, hence wanting to seek justice for it. And the extreme of all cases, people who blame all their problems on slavery. Black on black crime is white people's fault because
enslaved African people built the American economy.
It's completely justified to torture a white person because
can we talk about the almost 700 years of kidnapping and torture of African people?
Cop killers are black heroes because
how dare you put us through 500 years of colonialism, 500 years of slavery.
Woo! Oh, it doesn't matter if slavery was abolished. Your ancestors were racist to my ancestors, so I'm gonna be racist to you because your ancestors did it first. But in all honesty, Gazi is not the only one at fault here. You get one person who says, you evil white people, you enslaved my ancestors. Someone else retaliates by saying, you greedy sellouts, you sold your own race. Back and forth, the same shit goes, and all this creates is a cycle of hate. A cycle of hate which will never be broken until people realize this. Slavery is an ancient institution which was practiced by all cultures globally. Japan, China, Mesopotamia, the Vikings, Barbary Corsairs, Romans, Africans, Americans, the Lannisters. Slavery runs so deep that chances are that everyone's ancestors were involved in it at some point of time. There isn't any one particular race which was responsible for slavery. Africans sold slaves for wealth and power. Americans bought the slaves for wealth and power. Africans enslaved white people when they had the power to do so. Americans enslaved black people when they had the power to do so. The Arabs enslaved everybody when they had the power to do so. If you're that eager on blaming someone for slavery, then you better be blaming everybody instead of a particular race, because the blood would be on everyone's hands. My dramatic enough motherfucker. But Abster, chattel slavery was the worst of its kind. Black people were treated the worst among everyone else. I will have my vengeance and I will feel guilty forever because my ancestors practiced slavery. Well, you might be right. Chattel slavery might have been the worst form of slavery and black people might have been treated the worst when compared to everyone else. But the thing is, vengeance and guilt are traits which should be exhibited if a person feels that they could have done something different to change the past in some way better. But history always followed a very strict pattern. The initial pattern for slavery was for survival reasons. If they hadn't enslaved and conquered the lands of others, then a lot of communities would have slowly been wiped out of history. So there is literally no way slavery could have been avoided, and I do not find anything morally wrong in the birth of slavery because it was the only logical option people could have chosen. The next step in the pattern was people transitioning from just surviving to succeeding. If having slaves which contributed to manpower led to survival, then having more slaves which will contribute to having more manpower, which in turn means more profit, will lead to success. What is considered as success in the present is quite different from the past. To us, getting a job or getting a raise or spanking all your subscribers could be considered as success. But during a time when people's lives revolved around wars, conquering land and owning slaves, success was basically winning battles, expanding your territory, getting good rewards, and obviously you're going to end up capturing more slaves. The moral values they had were completely different from us because the life they lived was completely different from us. The final step in the pattern was normalization or becoming desensitized to things. When wars and colonization was dominant, slavery kept happening again and again. Slavery got normalized and people got desensitized to it. This is the primary reason slavery took a very brutal direction later in history. And I get it, when you look at clips like these, it's quite infuriating to black people. But the truth is, being desensitized to things is a very common trait which we possess as a species. Not only is this trait unavoidable, but it's also a necessary trait in us human beings. The reason why we shiver or projectile vomit while looking at the insides of a human being cut open or witnessing the scene of a brutal murder investigation, but an experienced surgeon or a cop on the other hand, they don't share the same feelings as us. This is because after numerous amount of surgical operations being done or after numerous amount of murder investigations, these people get desensitized to it. Being desensitized to things is a trait which allows these people to be proficient in their jobs. Every human trait has a positive and negative impact associated to it. The same trait of being desensitized which led to millions of slaves' death is also the same trait which is currently being used to save millions of lives and prevent millions of crimes from ever being committed. And there is no way you can prevent a person from being desensitized to things. And while I'm at it, let me just throw in a deduction from my part. Throughout the pattern, slaves were trying to fight the masters to free themselves from slavery, and the slave owners fought back. The more resistance the slaves showed, the more brutal the countermeasures were from the slave owners. There was this constant power struggle between the slaves and the slave owners. But if, in a hypothetical situation, during the timeline when chattel slavery was at its initial rise, if the slaves had collectively fought a war against the slave owners and won, then there would have been a shift in power. The slave owners would have become the new slaves, and the slaves would have become the new slave owners. Why? Because something consistent I found while looking into the birth of slavery is that in almost all cultures during the early days, people operated with a very primitive logic. Two sides to every battle. The winning side exhibits power, the losing side submitted to the said power. The prisoners of every war were enslaved. And it was only later in history did people navigate away from this logic, and it was only during that time was it safe to revolt against slavery collectively, which they did and which we'll get to. So had the prisoners of war who were sold from Africa as slaves collectively fought against the Englishmen during the initial rise of chattel slavery and won, then I highly doubt they would have navigated away from using the same logic. This would not have ended slavery in any way. There would have just been an exchange in power. The final outcome would have still been the same, that is, slavery would have still existed. Only who gets to be the slave would have changed. Instead of black people complaining about slavery, you would have white people taking their place instead. Furthermore, there would have been a heavy riot where the slaves would have destroyed all the crops and burned down all the supplies. Everything which they worked on would be ruined by the war. It would have been a state of extreme chaos and disorder, exactly like what happened in Jamestown during Bacon's Rebellion. And the result of such a large-scale war during the initial timeline would have created extremely catastrophic results. If you believe chattel slavery was the worst possible outcome, then I want you to rethink the possibility of what would have happened if people had collectively fought against slavery earlier than they did. It would not have favored the winning or the losing side, because even the winning side would have just been the ruler of ashes. Even a factor such as the black slaves revolting and winning against the plantation owners earlier than they did would have led to extremely unfavorable results. And this would have just extended the time it took to abolish slavery. Which is why I believe that the route which history took to reach here is one of the best ways it could have happened. So for people who want to avenge their ancestors or people who are suffering from excess guilt syndrome, think of a hypothetical situation and give me one occurrence in this pattern which you think could have been stopped by you or anyone to avoid slavery. If you can't, then I want you guys to know that you're using your emotions for the very wrong reasons. I do believe that Gazi and his supporters' intention is to fight against racism, but you do not fight against racism by demonizing an entire race, and you especially don't fight against racism by becoming a racist yourself. Slavery was pretty much like the butterfly effect. It started as small local events which began for survival, and it ended up forming strikingly large global level consequences, and there is literally no way anyone could have avoided it. When it comes to the Holocaust or World War, they were individual events which could have been prevented. Slavery, on the other hand, was driven by basic human characteristics and logic. Choosing the best path for survival, the need for success, getting desensitized to things. All these are basic human traits which just cannot be avoided. In fact, it was only because of these traits did slavery even come to an end. People seem to think that the primary reason slavery came to an end was because of the freedom fighters who fought against it. But it wasn't. The primary reason slavery ended was because of the passage of time and the advancement in science and technology. Medicines, agriculture, clothing and shelter received a huge boost in quality because of the advancement in science. The life expectancy of humans kept increasing. The new generations which followed during this passing timeline looked at the world in an entirely different way. They didn't have to look at the constant death and suffering the previous generations had to endure. They looked at a world when it was much more peaceful. They were able to form longer lasting relationships with others unlike their ancestors, and they started to value human lives as much more special. And for these people, slavery was an unnecessary and brutal practice. They questioned the morality of it. They realized that it wasn't required for anyone's survival. Instead, it was this morally dark and disgusting chapter where people enslaved others just because they've been doing it their entire lives, and because it became quite comfortable to own slaves. This led to the opposition of slavery from both the slaves and the non-slaves. Between the years 1790 to 1830, people sued for freedom. People escaped or helped others to escape. Both the slaves and non-slaves held many anti-slavery speeches. And when peaceful methods did not work, people started revolting more, destroying property, killing slave owners and striking fear. So the slave owners thought of fixing this problem. If their success and survival was being threatened by the same slavery system which helped them until now, then it's time to make some changes. So they decided to move to a better form of work. They focus more on machines because unlike humans, they don't fight back. The Industrial Revolution ensured that there was a burst in the growth of machinery. It also reduced the need for unskilled manual labor which the slaves had been providing. Technology revolutionized the world as more the number of machines which came into picture kept increasing, the more the need for slaves as manpower kept decreasing. People did what they have been doing throughout history. They moved to a better workforce from human slaves to machines. This led to the knots which tied slavery together to be loosened. If the advancement in science and technology never happened, then the life expectancy of people would have still been low. People would have never got the chance to value human lives as we do, and they would have never got the chance to question the morality of slavery. There would have been a higher demand for human slaves, and people would have never felt the need to abolish slavery. The reason why I believe that moral presentism leads to racism is because people feel that they are morally superior to the people of the past. And my point is, we are no morally superior to any of them. Most of us were born at a time when slavery was already abolished. We have grown up with an incredibly comfortable environment to be calling the people of the past as evil. Morality changes with the passage of time, and as we move forward, it gets more refined. People made mistakes in the past, people make mistakes in the present, and they'll continue to make mistakes in the future. But the whole point of advancing is to learn from our mistakes and to move forward, not to stagnate at one place, blaming the mistakes of the past which was already rectified. If you look at history as a big picture instead of taking individual historical figures or events, then the conclusion you'll draw is that history was a chain of inevitable events which happen one after another. If slavery was going to be normalized, then race-based slavery is going to be an inevitable outcome. And if race-based slavery was going to be normalized, then racism is an inevitable outcome. You just cannot have one event without the other event following it. If you're going to discover how to make fire, then the resultant smoke which pollutes the air is an inevitable outcome. There is no point in blaming the fire for causing the smoke. What needs to be done is noticing the negative impacts the smoke had caused and trying to control it, which is exactly what people did. Once people realized the negative impacts of slavery, they fought against it, they abolished it, and they made various laws to ensure that the pattern does not repeat itself. Could they have abolished slavery sooner than they did? Maybe, maybe not. But that's a pointless question because they abolished it. There is no point in beating a dead horse, and if you do, you will look incredibly foolish. And that is a wrap on the first episode of the series, cons. Of course, I have much more to say regarding other types of racism, reparations, and diving deeper into Gazi's head to show you what are the other things which caused him to make the grand change. But all in due time. For now, I'll end it with a grand and punchline. If you want to fight against racism, then go ahead. Just don't end up becoming a racist in the process. Catch you guys next time.
Come to the dark side.